Friday, September 25th, 2020, Houston, Texas. As the work week winds down, all is quiet in the city's west side enclave of Memorial.
Houston is comprised of a lot of smaller towns and cities once you get outside of the kind of metro area. So Memorial is one of the areas heading out to the suburbs.
Memorial is especially affluent. You see a lot of high-dollar homes and apartments and things like that.
But as night falls on this peaceful suburb, a desperate 911 call comes in to local dispatchers.
Houston 911, do you need medical, police, or fire?
I'm at my daughter's house, and we need an officer to do a welfare check.
The caller says no one in the family has heard from her stepdaughter, 29-year-old Emma Shea Kirby, in 5 days.
Emmy's family contacted the apartment maintenance worker to let them into the apartment.
However, there is no sign of her inside.
No one has heard from her since Sunday. We've been trying to call her. She's not responding. She's not responding to messages.
They had no trace of her at all, and it's just really weird.
Okay, a police unit will be dispatched.
Emma Shea Emmy Kirby was small in size, but made a big impact on everyone she met.
Emma Shea was 4'9" and about 100 pounds, and she was definitely the light of the room.
She was very friendly, very outgoing, and just a very lovable person.
Emmy was a substitute teacher for the Katy ISD, which is the large independent school district out there in the Katy Memorial area.
Emma Shea loved working with children.
She also loved animals. She had 2 small dogs that she adopted, and she treated them like they were her babies.
But even though Emmy had her dogs to keep her company, she craved more companionship.
Emma Shea was 29. She was looking to settle down and have a family.
Hey, what brings you in today?
Just an oil change.
And when she met a 28-year-old mechanic named Javon Gilbert in the spring of 2019, she felt an immediate connection.
She took her car in to get serviced and ended up meeting Javon Gilbert. He was tall, dark, and handsome, which was her type.
Got any plans for later on?
Nope.
There was an exchange of phone numbers, and from there the relationship started.
He was somebody that was very sure of himself, and so this charismatic personality that he had is what won Emma Shea over.
She was excited to see where the relationship could go.
Within months, the flirtatious spark was firing on all cylinders.
It was a whirlwind romance, and she finally felt like she found a stable relationship.
She had introduced him to her family, and in December of 2019, in fact, they had vacationed in Cabo with her parents.
The family got to know Javon a little bit, and it just seemed like a match made in heaven.
Once they returned from their trip, the relationship continued to flourish.
Things just continued to go really fast in the relationship.
She was so in love with him.
They were basically living life to the fullest.
But in September of 2020, police have just arrived at Emma Shea Kirby's apartment, where it appears she has disappeared without a trace.
Emma Shea's family knew something was not right and got to the point where once they could not reach Emma Shea, they reached out to the police.
Emma Shea had such a supportive family. They all rallied together.
Houston police,
Emma Shea's father and stepmother quickly relay their concerns to the responding officers.
It is completely abnormal. We get over here, we gain access to the apartment. The dogs are in there, which is completely unlike her. These dogs are like her babies.
When entry is made by the parents, they realize that there is a set of keys that is still within the apartment.
I found her keys slipped on the back of the door. All 3 of her apartment keys are there, but the door was locked.
But there's no sign that Emmy has been home anytime recently.
That's certainly concerning because we have apartment keys, but they can't locate her phone at that time. They also don't locate her purse within her apartment.
Yeah, that's really strange that she would take off like that.
They knew something was wrong. It just looked like she vanished.
For 29-year-old Emma Shea Kirby, the future looked extremely bright.
Emmy had been a pretty successful young woman. She comes from an affluent family.
She was a substitute teacher, and she was aspiring to become a full-time teacher.
And she had recently fallen in love.
She was in a committed relationship with a local mechanic named Javon Gilbert.
He was very supportive of her dreams. It appeared that he was just the perfect man for her.
But now, after being unable to reach Emmy for nearly a week, her family has shown up at her apartment in West Houston to discover some worrisome signs.
We didn't find her phone in the house, but it's going straight
To voicemail, so it's off, okay.
Yeah, it's not even ringing.
The family is very stressed out right now. They filed a missing persons report.
At this point, they're just trying to figure out where she is.
But hours later, as the sun rises over Houston, there's still no sign of Emma Shea.
Police came back over to the apartment the next day to follow up with Emma Shea's family.
Y'all already made a report last night?
Yeah, missing persons report.
Emma Shea's parents tell police that they were able to locate her car in the light of day, but its location gave them pause.
It's parked in a completely different parking lot, a distance away.
Her parents pointed out to the police that her car was in a spot that didn't make any sense for it to be across the lot.
The family leads police to Emma Shea's vehicle.
It's at the backside of the building. This is the back of the building.
Yeah.
The keys found inside Emma Shea's apartment allow police easy access into her car.
They searched the car, but they really don't find anything.
When police ask if there's anyone else who might have access to Emma Shea's car or apartment, her family reveals she recently dated a man named Javon Gilbert.
Javon was staying over periodically, and that led to longer and longer stays, and he eventually moved in.
But Emma Shea's parents say the relationship had run its course.
They had recently broke up about 2 weeks ago.
They broke up.
The boyfriend and her.
He subsequently moved out.
Javon moved in with his father, and Emmy was moving into another apartment that was a little bit more affordable for her.
Emmy was in the process of packing up to move there on her own with her dogs.
Emmy's family goes on to explain they've been in contact with Javon over the past week regarding Emmy's whereabouts.
He had told her family he hadn't seen her, hadn't heard from her.
He didn't have a key, did he?
He's claiming that he doesn't have a key.
Okay.
After taking down Javon's contact information for their report, police take a closer look at the inside of Emma Shea's apartment.
Interestingly enough, there was no sign of forced entry at all. There wasn't any evidence of foul play.
There were a lot of items that appeared to be being packed in preparation for a move, which was expected. However, there were items such as furniture, couches, things like that that were in fact missing that wasn't expected at this point.
Without evidence of foul play, there's only so much police can do.
There was no obvious signs of her being in trouble at that time other than a grown woman not being at home.
Still, investigators want to help Emmy's family as much as possible.
Police actually went to Emmy's apartment management, and they asked for footage to see what was going on outside of the apartment.
However, they immediately hit a roadblock.
I don't know how to use that.
Oh, okay.
My manager is usually the one who does it, and he's not here right now.
Okay. Well, we're not going to go nowhere with this.
Despite their best efforts, the missing persons team will need an official warrant to obtain the footage. And as the hours tick by, the search for Emma Shea intensifies.
parties gather together and start working their own investigation, as family often do, in an attempt to assist law enforcement with finding Emma Shea.
As a mother, as a father, they're trying to do their very best to get the word out to the community in terms of, have you seen Emma Shea?
The family makes flyers and posters to put up around the neighborhood and hand out.
They also enlist the help of an organization called Texas EquiSearch.
Texas EquiSearch began in 2000 as a nonprofit volunteer search organization, and we search for missing people.
We have drones, ATVs, and then a group of foot searchers. Everyone puts in where they can to help out the families that need it in whatever way.
Meanwhile, missing persons investigators with Houston PD reach out to Emma Shea's ex-boyfriend, Javon Gilbert.
Police are typically going to speak to the significant other when there is a missing person because they're the person who is closest to the victim.
Hey, is this Javon?
Yeah.
Hey, how you doing, man? My name's Officer May. I'm with HPD Missing Persons Division. I saw your name in the report that you used to date Emmy Shea Kirby?
Yeah.
He does confirm that they had broken up and that he had moved back in with his family.
Javon indicates that he and Emmy were still friends and were still cordial despite the fact that they were recent exes.
Last time I seen her was on Friday night.
That would have been the 18th?
Yeah, we went out to eat.
Javon says he drove over to Emmy's place, and then they left together to get burgers.
And then what?
We went to her house.
So you guys are just chatting about whatever, you know, your relationship, whatnot?
No, we weren't even chatting about a relationship.
They went up to her apartment and they Netflixed and chilled, so they say.
He says Emmy was acting normal.
You guys were hanging out there Friday night. What time did you leave?
I went there around like 11 something, and I made it home about like 12, because I have to go to work the next morning.
Javon indicates he drove home by himself to his father's place and that was the last time he ever saw Emmy.
However, Javon says the last time he communicated with Emma Shea was on Sunday, the same day her family last heard from her.
Okay, so she texted you on Sunday, September 20th?
Yeah, she said she was busy cleaning up.
He last heard from her via text on that Sunday, and so they were kind of getting a timeline of her last movements.
Why'd you guys end your relationship?
We ended our relationship because she was entertaining other dudes while she was with me.
Javon says he and Emmy broke up because he found out she was cheating on him after going through her phone.
She talked to these other dudes, just like chatting them up and flirting?
Well, a little bit more than that.
He reported that Emmy had been on an app on the internet that sets up young women with older men.
She was on this dating app. It's the sugar daddy app.
It was just red flag after red flag.
A week after Emma Shea Kirby was last seen, Houston police investigating the disappearance of the 29-year-old teacher are interviewing her ex-boyfriend, Javon Gilbert.
Emmy and Javon had just broken up about 2 weeks ago.
But according to him, they remain friends.
And now, Javon has just relayed a shocking new piece of information to investigators.
She was on this dating app. It's the sugar daddy app.
According to Javon, she continued to talk to other men from the sugar daddy websites, and that was a sore spot in the relationship.
It could be a situation where one of the men that she was allegedly talking to could have done something to her.
It was just red flag after red flag.
But that's not the only concerning information Javon reveals.
Javon indicated that Emmy was depressed a lot of the time and drinking heavily.
Like a big time drinker or just like a social drinker?
Nah, she's a heavy time drinker.
Javon said she was depressed and laying around a lot.
Since COVID started, she's just been at home, just watching YouTube. That's literally been her life. Like, she really didn't clean the house. I had to clean the house. Sometimes she really didn't even want to walk the dogs.
He's painting a picture of she was depressed and she possibly hurt herself, or her alcohol may have caused her to be missing and have something to do with this case.
So police have to investigate whether or not this is a legitimate claim.
All right, man. Well, hey, once again, I really appreciate your time.
All right.
At this point, police are looking at all the options.
Hoping to find out more, detectives start reaching out to Emmy's other loved ones. At the top of their list is her sister, Aaliyah.
The family said her sister and Emma Shea talked every day. And when she had not heard from Emma Shea, that's what sounded the alarm. That was something that was not normal.
She lived in Austin at the time. Aaliyah got to Houston as quick as she could and went to the station to help this investigation.
We want to talk about Emma Shea and your relationship with her.
Emma Shea is my older sister. We talk every day, multiple times a day. We would just video call each other, say what we had to say. I mean, sometimes like 5 times a day.
Emmy and Aaliyah were basically best friends as well as sisters.
She explains how odd, how weird it is that she hasn't talked to her sister in almost a week.
So when I would call her and she didn't even like text me or call me back in a reasonable to me amount of time, I was already calling her friends like, hey, do you know what's going on? Because one day for someone else may not be a big deal, but like for us, that was a big deal.
Investigators ask Aaliyah about Emmy's recent dating history, including anyone she may be talking to online.
Police ask Aaliyah if they had known of her to talk to any men from dating sites or sugar daddy websites, and Aaliyah says absolutely not, that this is not something that she would do.
That's when Aaliyah brings up someone who's already familiar to police, Javon Gilbert.
Aaliyah said she had some concerns about Javon.
Aaliyah says not long after Emma Shea and Javon started dating, the relationship took a downhill turn.
Javon ended up losing his job as a mechanic because, according to him, he was giving oil changes after hours, which Aaliyah thought was very suspicious.
And then him not truly working created some strain in the relationship too, because essentially she was taking care of everything.
Like the bills and rent.
After it was obvious that Javon wasn't going to seek more employment, Emmy got kind of tired of that and she basically kicked him out.
But Aaliyah says Javon wasn't willing to accept Emma Shea's new boundaries.
He would show up unannounced to places where she was. He would come to her apartment and look through her windows.
So she really begins to become concerned for her life because Javon is doing this stalking behavior.
And in mid-September, just a few weeks before Emma Shea went missing, the tense situation reached a tipping point.
Emma Shea was in her apartment asleep, and she felt like somebody was in her apartment.
She wakes up to find Javon standing over her holding a knife.
Houston detectives investigating the missing persons case of 29-year-old teacher Emma Shea Kirby have just learned that her ex, Javon Gilbert, had been stalking her in the weeks leading up to her disappearance.
Her sister had some concerns about Javon Gilbert, specifically dangerous behavior about breaking into Emma Shea's apartment, standing over her with a knife, and doing things that were making Emma Shea very, very fearful.
He's standing over her and she can't sleep. I'm like, wait, what? I was like, you need to call the cops or something, you know.
But to Aaliyah's dismay, her sister decided against involving the authorities at that time.
She's like, I don't know, sometimes it's hard because I don't like to just cut people off because I want to treat people how I would treat people. So she's still kind of like rationalizing.
However, Emma Shea did take other steps to try to protect herself from her ex.
She did contact her leasing office to inquire about the cost of ending the lease early.
I think that the timing is important because she is trying so desperately to get out of that apartment and to break the lease.
But now, Aaliyah is worried her sister didn't escape Javon's clutches soon enough.
I already know something is wrong. She's not okay, and it's because of him.
Aaliyah says even her last text messages with her sister now seem questionable.
She also explains to law enforcement how she recently got several texts from her sister's phone number, but those text messages were weird to her sister because they had emojis.
She didn't text you with emojis.
That wasn't the norm for her to put those.
Aaliyah told police that she thought that maybe those text messages were actually from Javon to make it look like she was alive and well.
After speaking with Aaliyah, detectives share her concerns about Javon. Is it possible everything he told police in his interview was an attempt to mislead them as well?
His story did not really line up with what Aaliyah said had happened, so they were interested in finding out a little bit more about this guy.
They run Javon's name through the database, and they discover that he is on probation and deferred adjudication for arson.
Although MSJ never filed any police reports against Javon, years earlier, another woman had.
Police see a protective order from a woman named Lily Chin, and they can also see that this is Javon's ex-wife.
Detectives immediately track down Lily Chen, and she agrees to speak with them about Javon.
We know that you had a real hard time with Javon. Can you tell us about y'all's relationship?
I met him in high school.
Okay.
She basically tells police that Javon was her high school sweetheart. You know, they eventually had a baby together, and things were good until they turned bad.
Lily says the first red flag she noticed was how Javon treated animals.
Lily tells investigators that when they moved in together, she had 4 pets. And so one by one, they started dying.
He killed a dog.
He killed the dog.
If that's not crazy, I don't know what is. If somebody can do that to an animal, Lord only knows what they could do to a person.
Then Javon's abusive behavior carried over to the couple's infant child.
Lily actually mentions that his daughter, when she would cry, there was abuse.
She was afraid of me. She does not cry. So he would put her in the closet. But I had to go grab the baby.
After the fiasco with the child endangerment, things just went downhill from there. She decided to move out.
That's why I moved out of the place we lived together.
Okay.
She was ready to start, fresh, and was very adamant about not providing Javon with the location as to where she was.
But before long, she realized Javon had figured out her new address.
I realized he started following me from my job. I saw him in the apartment complex.
Then one night, something even more terrifying happened while Lily was asleep in her new apartment.
I woke up like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I have a Japanese sword, the long one.
Yeah.
He was holding that next to my bed.
To detectives, the incident sounds eerily familiar.
They learn that he has done actions that are consistent with what they are seeing during their investigation with Emmy, specifically breaking into her home, holding in the ex-wife's case, a samurai sword compared to the knife, but consistent.
It's very familiar to us.
Oh, really?
Yes.
I was so scared. I said, you had to leave. I'm gonna call the police.
But for Lily, her waking nightmare wasn't over yet.
Then he puts chloroform over her face, just like in the movies.
He kind of like covered my mouth and passed out. And next thing in the morning, I woke up.
Afterwards, Lily didn't hear from Javon for months. But he still wasn't done terrorizing her.
She was in her home asleep, and she was awoken out of her sleep by the smells of smoke.
I saw I was dreaming. I woke up, but I saw there was smoke just everywhere.
Her apartment was actually on fire.
Investigators in Houston, Texas now believe Javon Gilbert is behind the disappearance of his ex-girlfriend, Emma Shea Kirby.
They see a lot of the signs of abuse with Emma Shea that they're starting to hear about and learn happened with the ex-wife.
Javon's ex-wife Lily describes a harrowing tale of survival to investigators.
After not hearing from Javon for months, Lily woke up to smoke filling her apartment.
Her home was on fire and there was not a way for her to exit the home safely.
When she looked out of the window, she saw her ex-husband, Javon Gilbert, in the parking lot.
That's why I called 911.
Help me, please. My ex set my apartment on fire.
You want to kill me?
Fortunately, emergency personnel were able to put out the blaze and get Lily and her daughter to safety.
Javon was arrested and charged with arson. They found a gas canister and lighter in his car that essentially confirmed he was responsible.
In 2015, Javon Gilbert pled guilty to arson. It's a first-degree felony which carries a range of punishment from 5 years in prison up to 99 years or life.
But because Javon didn't have any prior criminal convictions, he walked away with only probation.
The judge decided that an 8-year deferred adjudication was an appropriate sentence in this case.
It was around that same time that Javon met Emma Shea Kirby.
Emmy didn't know what he was capable of.
For detectives, it's now clear that Javon has a propensity for violence.
It's very clear that Javon wanted to control these women when he did not get his way in these romantic relationships and when they were no longer willing to put up with some of his behaviors. Then at that point, it triggered him and sent him spiraling.
However, investigators will need more evidence to prove Javon was involved in Emma Shea's disappearance.
At this point, they still don't know where Emma Shea is.
But as search efforts continue, investigators finally get their hands on a crucial piece of evidence.
Police are finally able to secure the surveillance video from the apartment complex, and they are able to see Javon on the night of September 18th at Emma Shea's apartment.
Around 9 p.m., they see Javon leaving with Emmy.
They do leave in her car to go to dinner, as Javon had indicated in his original interview.
They arrive back at the apartment together 40 minutes later.
The couple returns to the apartment, park her car, and they walk in together.
Everything looks normal on the tape. It doesn't appear that they were arguing or fighting, and looks like everything is fine.
When Emma Shea and Javon Gilbert walk into the apartment, that's the last time Emma Shea is ever seen alive, is on that surveillance camera.
At that point, Javon's statement to police is no longer supported by the surveillance footage.
He tells investigators that he left Emma Shea at 11 o'clock p.m. However, cameras show Javon actually leaving Emma Shea's apartment at 1:40 a.m. and Emma Shea is not with him.
They see him there at 1:40 in the morning, carrying a somewhat large package out of the apartment.
He loads the large item into the back of Emmy's car and drives off.
Almost an hour later, Javon returns to the apartment complex in Emmy's car, parking it in the spot where her family later found it.
Investigators have to consider that what they just witnessed on the surveillance footage is Javon disposing of Emmy's body.
The surveillance footage shows Javon returning to Emmy's apartment several times over the following days.
They see him carrying the sofa to the dumpster and disposing of it.
Detectives now wonder, was there forensic evidence on that sofa?
Unfortunately, by the time Homicide is able to get the surveillance, the trash in that location had already been picked up, and we were unable to locate any items of interest for the investigation.
However, volunteers with Texas EquiSearch have not given up their hunt for Emma Shea.
We got really involved in the mission at that point.
And they are about to make a vital discovery during their search of a local park.
I believe we had about 23 people that showed up for the search. I was in the front, and a deer ran in front of me. And I thought, this is crazy, because who sees a deer in Houston?
As Sheila follows the deer's path, the hair on the back of her neck stands up.
I caught an odor and saw something that just didn't sit right with me. I was trying to figure out what it was I was seeing.
Tammy!
We knew we found her. God put those deers there for a reason.
After unearthing a shocking history of violence and abuse, Houston detectives are certain 28-year-old Javon Gilbert is behind the disappearance and suspected murder of his ex-girlfriend, Emma Shea Kirby.
Now they just need to find her body in order to finally arrest Javon.
And on October 3rd, more than 2 weeks since Emma Shea was last seen, volunteers with Texas EquiSearch make the tragic discovery in a local park.
I caught an odor and saw something that just didn't sit right with me.
Tammy!
We found human remains, and it was Emma Shea.
When the autopsy was performed on Emmy's body, the coroner found that she had been strangled.
During my experience, strangulation is a very personal attack.
But that's not Emmy's only injury.
She suffered a gunshot wound to the right side of her forehead.
On January 20th, 2021, police finally take Javon into custody.
The police arrest him. They get him down to the station. He agrees to talk to the police.
Obviously, you know what this is about, right?
Yep. It's during that conversation that they're able to start confronting him with all of the information that they have.
We've gathered a lot of data. We've gathered a lot of surveillance video.
Still, Javon sticks to the same story he originally told police.
Javon states he left Emmy's house around 11 p.m. on September 18th.
He still wouldn't admit any type of involvement, and then they show him the video.
You want to see the video of the night of?
Yeah, we can do that too.
Clearly, Emmy is seen entering her apartment with Javon on the night of the 18th. But she never leaves. At least, not by her own will.
You're gonna see a guy walking out right here from her apartment. Sets this object down that he carried out, this big heavy object. Are you denying that this is you? You're just kind of sitting there like a bump on a log, so to speak. You gotta have something to say about it.
When they showed them the video of him taking a heavy object out of that apartment, he lawyered up and didn't want to talk to the police anymore.
I'm done. Huh? I'm done. You're done? Mm-hmm. You don't want to talk no more? Okay.
When he says that he wants a lawyer, that sort of sealed that investigators were on to what actually happened with Emma Shea Kirby.
At that point, law enforcement charged Javon Gilbert with the murder of Emma Shea Kirby. They also charged him with tampering with evidence for taking her body and moving it.
Because Javon is still on probation from the arson charge, prosecutors decide to take an unorthodox approach to his murder charge.
This was an unusual circumstance. The arson that he was on probation for and the murder that he was charged with carry the exact same range of punishment.
Despite all the evidence they have against Javon for Emma Shea's murder, it's only circumstantial. There's a risk that the jury could find him not guilty.
The prosecutor wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to get away. So it was like, okay, well, if we can get him on the arson charges, that automatically carries a sentence of life.
So we use the murder case as a triggering event to revoke his probation and move forward on that first.
Instead of taking Javon to trial, prosecutors file a motion to adjudicate guilt.
This isn't a jury trial. It's the judge listening to the evidence and having to determine have we proven the facts of the case such that he can find those allegations true and at that point revoke the probation.
Prosecutors tell the judge that Javon violated his probation in the most egregious way possible by murdering his ex-girlfriend, Emmy Kirby.
I think Javon Gilbert knew that Emma Shea was done with him. She wasn't giving him any more chances, and that's the most dangerous time in the life of an intimate partner victim.
Javon had finally realized that Emmy was done with him and that she didn't need him anymore, and she was really set to start a new life.
I think what made him snap is that he realized he no longer had control, and she stood up to him, and that made him really angry.
She was probably being brutally honest with him. He didn't want to hear it, so he strangled her to death.
But the violence didn't end there.
Prosecutors believe that Javon then shot her in the head just out of anger or spite.
After his rage subsided, Javon immediately began to try and cover up the crime.
He got rid of the evidence, which is primarily the couch, got her body, took it out, put it in a car, drove it to Bear Creek Park, dumped it, and went back to try to clean up the rest of the scene.
Prosecutors also believe Javon continued sending texts from Emmy's phone over the next few days to intentionally point investigators in the wrong direction.
Essentially, Javon had Emmy's phone and was texting himself and other people, trying to make it seem like Emmy was actually communicating and reaching out to family members.
The phone is never recovered, and there was never a gun that was recovered during this investigation.
He probably was just smart enough to know that if he discarded a gun, it couldn't be connected to him. And there are plenty of waterways and little creeks and stuff in that Bear Creek Park for plenty of opportunity to do that.
However, by the end of the hearing, the judge agrees that Javon is in violation of his probation.
Javon ultimately was sentenced to life in prison for arson.
I believe that the family was satisfied with the ultimate verdict and prioritizing the old arson case over the homicide case. And when we did end up with a life sentence, I thought they were happy with the result.
But what does it say about our court system that Javon was able to walk away free after the arson attempt against his ex-wife? If Javon had been put behind bars then, maybe he never would have been able to do what he did to Emmy.
When looking at intimate partner violence, when trying to escape these sort of relationships, the most critical time and the most dangerous time is when these folks are trying to escape. With Lily and with Emmy, they were both desperately trying to get away from this particular person.
I would encourage anybody that's in a relationship that there are the red flags. Separate yourself so you can get away from that person and continue with your life. You may save your own life by leaving that person.
Abuse is never okay. If you or someone you love is in an abusive relationship, there is help available. Call the Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE.
On the evening of July 19, 2020, a quiet suburban home in North Brunswick, New Jersey, became the center of a crime that would reach far beyond one family. From the outside, there was nothing unusual about the house. It was a place where a family could expect an ordinary summer night, when the dangers of the world seemed far away. Inside lived Esther Salas, a federal judge, her husband Mark Anderl, an attorney, and their only son, 20-year-old Daniel Andor. Daniel had not chosen the courtroom. He had not written legal opinions, filed lawsuits, or made enemies in political battles surrounding the federal judiciary. He was simply a young man living his life inside his family home. Yet that night, someone came to that house carrying a gun and pretending to be someone he was not. There was a knock at the door. It was a small, ordinary event. A delivery at a private residence. Nothing about it should have suggested that death was standing on the other side. Mark Andor went toward the entrance. The person waiting outside had arrived disguised as a delivery worker. The disguise was a key, designed to turn suspicion into trust long enough to bring a stranger within shooting distance. Then the door opened. Within moments, Mark was shot. Daniel was shot. The young man who had done nothing to place himself inside the conflict was struck down in his own home. Mark survived, gravely wounded. Daniel did not. Somewhere inside the house was Esther Salas, the person the attacker was believed to have been seeking. But she was not at the door. That circumstance may have separated life from death. Daniel and his father were the people who directly faced the gunman. And Daniel had no chance to survive. The story that followed became an investigation into obsession, grievance, revenge, and resentment turning violent. At its center was Roy Den Hollander, a lawyer who had appeared before Judge Salas and built a worldview around perceived discrimination against men. Investigators later found writings attacking women, criticizing Salas, and expressing anger toward people he believed had wronged him. But the most disturbing part of the story was not simply that a judge had been targeted. It was that her son had paid the price. Daniel Andor was 20 years old. At 20, life is usually measured in beginnings. There are plans that have not yet happened, roads that have not yet been traveled, and conversations families assume they will have someday. Daniel was the son of Esther Salas and Mark Andor, and his death tore a permanent hole through a family that had expected to watch him grow older, not become the subject of a federal murder investigation. The facts of his final night are stark. A stranger arrived at the family home, concealed his identity, and opened fire when Mark opened the door. Daniel was killed instantly. His father was wounded. His mother survived. But facts alone cannot explain the cruelty of what happened. To understand that cruelty, it is necessary to step backward, before the knock on the door, before the gun, before the investigators began connecting names and dates. Because this was not a crime that appeared from nowhere. It emerged from grievances developing for years. Esther Salas had built a career inside the American justice system. She became a federal judge in New Jersey after being nominated by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the Senate in 2011. Her position gave her authority, but also placed her name in court records, legal disputes, and public databases. Judges make decisions that can change people's lives, even when people disagree with them. Roy Den Hollander did not seem willing to leave disagreement inside the courtroom. In 2015, he brought a federal lawsuit challenging a policy concerning military registration requirements that applied to men but not women. The case came before Esther Salas. To the legal system, it was another dispute to be considered through motions, arguments, and judicial procedure. For Den Hollander, however, the conflict did not end when the legal process moved on. Over time, his writings revealed a darker pattern. His words were not simply arguments about law. They could become personal attacks, especially toward women. His resentment appeared to grow into something broader, more consuming, something that needed names and faces. And Esther Salas had a name. She was no longer only a judge in a courtroom. In Den Hollander's writings, investigators would find evidence that she had become part of a personal narrative in which he cast himself as the victim and others as his enemies. This is where the psychology of grievance becomes important. A person can lose a case without becoming violent. Anger alone does not explain murder. What matters is the transformation of anger into fixation, the point at which another person becomes a symbol of everything the offender believes has been taken from him. By July 2020, Den Hollander had reached that point, according to investigators. And the timing was terrifying. 8 days before the attack on the Salas family, another man connected to the same broad ideological world had been killed. Mark Angelucci, a California attorney known for his work involving men's rights, was shot at his home on July 11. Investigators would later see disturbing similarities between the two attacks. The assailant in the Angelucci case had also approached the home while posing as a delivery worker. The method suggested preparation and patience. It also suggested that a familiar-looking stranger could cross the invisible boundary between public space and a home. Then came July 19. The Salas family could not have known that a chain of events was already closing around them. There was no courtroom that night. No judge's bench, no legal argument, no opposing attorneys. There was only a house, a husband, a wife, a son, and a visitor at the door. When Mark approached the entrance, he could not have known that the person outside had allegedly come because of his wife. Daniel could not have known that a legal dispute from years earlier had become part of a stranger's obsession. Neither father nor son had the opportunity to prepare for the violence that was about to enter their home. The first shots transformed an ordinary evening into chaos. Mark was hit and badly wounded. Daniel was killed. Esther survived because she was not standing at the door when the gunman attacked. The killer fled quickly afterward. For the family, the world had changed in seconds. For investigators, the clock had started. Within hours, federal authorities were working to identify the attacker and determine why someone had traveled to the home of a sitting judge. Was this a random act? Was the judge the target? Was the attack connected to another shooting? Had someone been watching her? Had someone obtained her address? The questions multiplied because the crime contained a message. The attacker had not simply fired into a random house. He had gone looking for Esther Salas. Yet the person who died was her son. The next day, investigators announced that Roy Den Hollander had become the primary subject in the attack. Then came another shocking discovery. Den Hollander was dead in New York, having apparently taken his own life with a firearm. There would be no dramatic arrest, interrogation room, or courtroom confrontation. No defendant would sit beside a lawyer while prosecutors described the final minutes of Daniel Anderl's life. Instead, investigators had to reconstruct the mind of a dead man through the evidence he had left behind. They would examine weapons, vehicles, writings, electronic information, travel, and names. They would search for connections between California and New Jersey, and study the people Den Hollander had written about or appeared to consider enemies. And slowly, a terrifying possibility emerged. Daniel may never have been the intended target at all. He may have been the innocent person standing closest to the door when a grievance against a judge finally crossed the line into murder. Because Daniel's story is not ultimately about the legal dispute that brought Den Hollander into Esther Salas's courtroom. It is about what happens when a person decides that disagreement is persecution, that frustration is betrayal, and that revenge is justified. It is about how a name on a court document can become a fixation, how a public address can become a destination, and how an ordinary family home can suddenly become the place where someone else's hatred arrives. On that July night, Daniel Anderl was not a judge. He was not a litigant. He was not an opponent. He was a son. And when the door opened, that should have been enough. It should have been the safest moment in the world, a family home, a familiar entrance, a summer evening, a 20-year-old life still unfolding. Instead, it became the final chapter of Daniel's life. And to understand how that happened, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the gunman arrived at the house in North Brunswick, before the name Roy Den Hollander became connected to one of the most disturbing attacks against a federal judge in modern American history, there was a family living an ordinary life. That distinction matters. True crime stories often begin with the crime itself. A door opens. A weapon appears. A victim falls. Police arrive. Investigators begin asking questions. But violence does not begin when the first shot is fired. In many cases, the path toward violence has been forming quietly for years, sometimes through resentment, fixation, humiliation, or an increasingly distorted view of the world. The story of Daniel Andel and his family was shaped by that invisible background. North Brunswick, New Jersey, was not the kind of place people associate with political violence or attacks on federal judges. It was a suburban community in Middlesex County, positioned between larger population centers and surrounded by the familiar landscape of American residential life. Streets lined with houses. Driveways. Lawns. Families moving through routines that rarely make the evening news. In the summer of 2020, however, the entire country was living through an atmosphere unlike anything most Americans had experienced before. The coronavirus pandemic had changed daily life. Streets were quieter. Businesses had closed or altered their operations. People spent more time inside their homes. Families watched the news from living rooms and kitchens, absorbing one alarming story after another. The outside world felt unstable. But inside a suburban home, routine still mattered. Meals were still prepared. Doors were still locked at night. Parents still worried about their children. A 20-year-old still had a life ahead of him. That 20-year-old was Daniel Andel. Daniel was the only child of Esther Salas and Mark Andel. His family life was connected to the law, but Daniel himself was not the central figure in the legal disputes that would eventually bring danger to their front door. His mother was a federal judge. That fact alone placed the family in a different category from most households. A federal judge does not simply work 9 to 5 and leave the consequences of professional decisions behind at the courthouse. Judicial decisions can create powerful emotions. One person may see a ruling as fair. Another may see the same ruling as an unforgivable injustice. For a judge, disagreement is part of the job. Threats are not. Esther Salas had spent years moving through a legal career that eventually led her to the federal bench. She had worked as a prosecutor before becoming a judge, building a reputation within the legal system and taking on cases that could involve serious disputes and serious consequences. In 2011, President Barack Obama nominated her to serve as a federal district judge in New Jersey. The Senate confirmed her, and she became the first Hispanic woman to serve as a federal district judge in New Jersey. Her position gave her authority, but it also placed her name in public records. A federal judge's name can appear on opinions, court filings, legal databases, news reports, and government documents. In an age when information can be collected and searched within seconds, a professional identity can become intertwined with personal information. That distinction would become crucial. Because the courthouse was not where the attack happened. The attack happened at home. The place where Esther Salas was supposed to be a mother rather than a judge. The place where Mark Andel was supposed to be a husband rather than an attorney. The place where Daniel was supposed to be simply Daniel. That separation between professional life and private life is one of the basic assumptions behind modern society. A judge can make a controversial ruling during the day and return home at night. A prosecutor can argue for a conviction and still expect to sleep safely in his own bed. A lawyer can represent one side of a dispute without expecting the opposing party to appear at his front door. That boundary is essential. Roy Den Hollander would eventually be accused of crossing it. Years before the shooting, Den Hollander had entered the legal system as a litigant. He was a lawyer who presented himself as an advocate for men's rights and repeatedly argued that men were disadvantaged by laws and institutions. His beliefs were controversial long before the attack. He wrote extensively, frequently using language that became increasingly hostile toward women. His worldview was built around grievances that he believed society had ignored or deliberately created. In 2015, one of those grievances brought him into a federal lawsuit concerning military registration requirements. The United States had long required men, but not women, to register with the Selective Service System. Den Hollander challenged the policy, arguing that it was unconstitutional discrimination. The case eventually came before Judge Esther Salas. In a functioning legal system, this should have been the end of the matter. A person believes a law is unconstitutional. He files a lawsuit. The judge considers the arguments. The court issues a decision. The legal process continues. But Den Hollander's personality and writings suggested that he did not experience the legal system as simply a mechanism for resolving disputes. He appeared to interpret disagreements through a much more personal lens. For him, institutions could become enemies. Judges could become enemies. Women could become enemies. And eventually, individual people could become symbols of everything he believed was wrong with the world. That distinction is important when examining motive. There is a difference between someone who is angry and someone who has built an identity around anger. Anger can fade. A grievance can become part of someone's daily thinking. The person begins revisiting old conflicts, rereading old documents, reconstructing conversations, remembering perceived insults, searching for someone to blame. Each repetition can strengthen the belief that the world has wronged them. The evidence investigators later examined suggested that Den Hollander had moved far beyond ordinary legal disagreement. His writings contained attacks against women and individuals he considered responsible for what he viewed as injustice. Esther Salas appeared within that landscape. But Salas was not simply a name on a legal document anymore. She was a person with a home. And somehow, Den Hollander was able to connect the public identity of the judge with her private location. This is one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The distance between a courtroom and a family home can seem enormous. In reality, it can be reduced to a few keystrokes. A name can be searched. A database can be opened. An address can be located. A map can show the route. What was once protected by physical distance can become accessible through information. By 2020, that reality was already becoming a serious concern for judges across the United States. Judges were receiving threats. Their names and addresses could be found online. Their families could become exposed to people angry about judicial decisions. But even knowing that threats exist does not mean a family expects someone to actually come to the door. That psychological gap is important. If every unpleasant letter were treated as a potential murder attempt, ordinary life would become impossible. People have to believe that the front door is still a boundary. That strangers cannot simply cross it. That the person delivering a package is probably delivering a package. That the person ringing the bell is probably not carrying a weapon. That night in July would destroy those assumptions for the Andor family. There was another reason investigators became especially interested in Den Hollander. Only 8 days before the attack on the Salas family, Mark Angelucci had been murdered in California. Angelucci was an attorney associated with men's rights advocacy. Like Den Hollander, he had been involved in legal arguments concerning gender and perceived discrimination against men. The circumstances surrounding his death immediately raised questions. Angelucci had been at his home when a man approached disguised as a delivery worker. Then he was shot. The similarity was difficult to ignore. One attack had happened in California. The other would happen in New Jersey. The victims were different. The locations were thousands of miles apart. But the alleged method of approach was remarkably similar. And both victims existed within a legal and ideological world that overlapped with Den Hollander's. For investigators, this changed the shape of the case. The shooting of the Salas family was no longer simply a single attack on one federal judge. It potentially belonged to a larger pattern. The question became whether the person who attacked the Andal home had been acting alone, whether he had planned other attacks, and whether there were additional people in danger. The answer became more frightening when investigators examined the material connected to Den Hollander. Names appeared. Targets appeared. People he had written about appeared. And Esther Salas was among them. The investigation began to reveal the possibility that the attack had not been spontaneous. It had required knowledge. It had required movement. It had required the attacker to travel to a specific location. It had required him to approach the house in a way that would not immediately trigger alarm. And most importantly, it required him to believe that he had a reason to be there. That is what separates a random act of violence from a targeted attack. A random attack happens because the victim happens to be present. A targeted attack begins long before the victim knows anything is wrong. Somewhere, a decision has already been made. A person has already been selected. A location has already been identified. A plan has already begun. The victim is simply waiting for the moment when the plan reaches them. Daniel had no way of knowing that such a plan existed. He had no reason to look at the front door and wonder whether someone had been studying his family. He was 20 years old. His world should have been about the future. Instead, the future had already been taken from him. For Esther Salas, the home represented something different from the courtroom. At work, she was Judge Salas. Her decisions were scrutinized. Lawyers argued before her. Litigants challenged her reasoning. Her name appeared on legal documents. At home, she was a mother. Daniel was her son. Mark was her husband. The people who lived there were not legal abstractions. They were a family. That is what makes the attack so psychologically disturbing. The alleged target was a judge. But the violence did not remain confined to the person who had made a judicial decision. It entered the private space around her. It reached the people she loved. And it killed the person who had never been part of the dispute at all. By the time the sun disappeared on July 19, 2020, nothing about the Salas family's home would ever feel completely ordinary again. The front door would no longer be simply a door. A delivery would no longer be simply a delivery. A stranger standing outside would no longer be simply a stranger. And the memory of one summer evening would become permanently connected to the soundless question that every parent fears most. Why him? Daniel had not chosen the fight. He had not written the lawsuit. He had not issued the ruling. He had not insulted the man investigators believed came to the house. He had simply been there. And sometimes, in the darkest crimes, that is the cruelest truth of all. The victim did not need to do anything to become a target. They only needed to be standing close enough to someone else's hatred. As July 19 approached its final hours, the Andal family had no idea that their home had become the destination of a man carrying a grievance that had been growing for years. They could not see the road behind him. They could not see the decisions he had already made. They could not see the weapon. They could not see the disguise. They could not see how quickly a normal evening was about to disappear. And Daniel could not know that the next few minutes would be the last minutes of his life. The door was still closed. The house was still a home. The family was still together. For one final moment, the danger was outside. Then came the knock. Part 3, The Victim's Story. Daniel Andal, the son who was never supposed to be a target. There are cases in which the name of the victim becomes inseparable from the crime. The murder is so shocking, the circumstances so extraordinary, that the person who died can slowly disappear behind the headlines. Federal judge targeted, Shooter disguised as delivery driver. Attorney murdered. Extremist vendetta. Judicial security threat. Those phrases describe the case. But they do not describe Daniel Andel. Daniel was not a judge. He was not a prosecutor. He was not a politician. He was not an activist. He had never stood at a podium demanding anything from the world. He had never issued a ruling against Roy Den Hollander. He had never argued against him in court. He had never written about him. He had never participated in the dispute that had consumed his mother's attention years earlier. Daniel was simply 20 years old. The only son of Esther Salas and Mark Andel. And on the night of July 19, 2020, that distinction became the most painful fact in the entire story. Because the person who had allegedly come to the house looking for a federal judge did not find her standing at the door. Instead, he found Daniel. And when the gunfire ended, it was the 20-year-old son who was dead. Daniel grew up in North Brunswick, New Jersey, in a family whose life was shaped by law, but not necessarily defined by it. His mother, Esther Salas, had built a career in the justice system. She had become a federal judge after being nominated by President Barack Obama and confirmed by the United States Senate in 2011. His father, Mark Andel, was an attorney. For many families, having parents working in law might mean dinner-table conversations about courtrooms, clients, hearings, and legal arguments. But Daniel was not a character in those professional worlds. He was their son. Their child. The person who existed outside the formal titles. To the public, his mother was Judge Esther Salas. To Daniel, she was simply Mom. His father was not merely an attorney. He was Dad. And that difference matters. Because when a person becomes a public figure, strangers begin to see the title before they see the human being. A judge becomes a robe. An attorney becomes an argument. A federal court becomes a building. But inside a family home, those identities disappear. There are ordinary mornings. Ordinary meals. Ordinary disagreements. The quiet routines that never make the news. And somewhere inside those routines was Daniel. There is something particularly difficult about reconstructing the life of someone who was not famous. The public record contains relatively little about him compared with the enormous amount of information that would later be written about the man accused of killing him. That imbalance is one of the quiet tragedies of true crime. The killer's writings can fill pages. His grievances can be analyzed. His movements can be reconstructed. His ideology can be dissected. His weapons can be catalogued. His final days can become the subject of documentaries and investigative reports. But the victim may leave behind only fragments. A name. An age. A photograph. A family description. A sentence in a federal document. A memory preserved by people who knew him. And yet those fragments are not insignificant. They are the pieces that remind us that the victim was not born on the day the crime happened. Daniel had a life before July 19, 2020. He had a childhood. He had parents who watched him grow. He had hopes that belonged to the future. He had a place in the family that could not simply be replaced. He was 20 years old. At 20, a person's life is usually still opening. There are decisions that have not yet been made. Places that have not yet been visited. Friendships that have not yet been formed. Mistakes that have not yet been made. Jobs that have not yet been started. Relationships that have not yet been experienced. There are still entire versions of yourself that you have never met. Daniel never had the chance to discover them. And that is perhaps the hardest way to understand what was lost. Not only a life that existed, but a life that was supposed to continue. At 20 years old, the future is not a finished story. It is an unwritten one. A person might change careers, move to another state, fall in love, travel, build a family, make his parents grandparents, become someone completely different from the young man he was at 20. Daniel was still standing at the beginning of that road. Then someone else's hatred interrupted it. The tragedy becomes even more painful when we consider the identity of the man who came to the house. Roy Den Hollander had once brought a legal challenge before Esther Salas. His case concerned military registration requirements that applied to men. The dispute belonged to the world of federal litigation. Arguments, briefs, motions, judicial decisions. A system designed to separate personal emotion from legal judgment. For a judge, disagreement is part of the job. A decision may anger one side. It may disappoint the other. A ruling can change the course of someone's plans. But the machinery of the courts exists partly because disagreements are supposed to remain within the boundaries of law. You lose a case. You appeal. You file another motion. You challenge the reasoning. You argue before another court. You do not go to the judge's home. You do not disguise yourself as a delivery worker. You do not arrive carrying a gun. And you certainly do not turn the judge's family into a battlefield. But according to investigators, that is the path Den Hollander ultimately took. And Daniel became caught in it. There is an especially cruel irony in the way the attack unfolded. The house was not a courtroom. There were no lawyers arguing across a table. There was no judge sitting behind a bench. There was no jury. There were no legal documents. There was simply a family at home. And then there was a knock at the door. That sound is almost painfully ordinary. A knock. A doorbell. A delivery arriving after dark. For most people, those sounds mean something mundane. A package. Food. A neighbor. A courier who needs a signature. But on that night, the ordinary became a disguise. The person outside allegedly presented himself as a delivery worker. And that detail is important because deception did not require a complicated disguise. It only needed to create a few seconds of hesitation. A uniform. A package. A familiar reason for being at the door. Enough to make the person inside believe that opening the door was safe. Mark Andrew went to answer. Daniel was there. And suddenly the world inside that home changed forever. Imagine the seconds before the shooting. There is a house in North Brunswick. The evening is moving toward night. Inside are people who have no reason to believe that they are about to become the center of a federal investigation. There is no courtroom tension. No police sirens. No warning. No announcement that danger is approaching. Then the door opens. For a fraction of a second, there may have been nothing remarkable about the person standing outside. A delivery worker. A stranger. Someone who appeared to have a reason to be there. Then the weapon appears. And the sound of gunfire destroys the illusion. The first shots are not something the human mind processes calmly. They are violent, abrupt, disorienting. A house that was moments earlier a private refuge suddenly becomes an enclosed space filled with terror. Mark Andrew is struck repeatedly. Daniel is struck. And Esther Salas is somewhere else inside the house. She survives. Daniel does not. There is a terrible randomness in that moment. Not randomness in the attacker's intentions. The attack itself appears to have been deliberate. But randomness in who physically stood in the wrong place at the wrong second. That distinction is crucial. The investigation would later focus heavily on Esther Salas. Her position as a federal judge. Her connection to Den Hollander. His writings. His grievances. His apparent list of targets. But Daniel was not responsible for any of those things. He did not create the legal system. He did not appoint his mother to the federal bench. He did not preside over Den Hollander's case. He did not write the ruling that had angered him. He did not become his enemy. Yet when the gunman arrived, Daniel was within reach. And the weapon did not care about the distinction between the judge and her son. For his parents, the psychological wound must have been different from anything the public could understand. Esther Salas survived the attack. But survival does not mean escaping the crime. Sometimes survival is where another part of the story begins. A mother who survives a violent attack against her family may continue to live with the knowledge that the person who came to her home was looking for her. And yet the bullet found her son. A father may survive physically while carrying the memory of his child dying in front of him. A family can leave the house. They can move. They can change locks. They can install cameras. They can speak with investigators. They can attend hearings. They can watch the case unfold in the media. But none of those actions restore the person who should still be there. The empty space at the table remains. The bedroom remains. The photographs remain. The memories remain. And the future remains painfully altered. Daniel was his parents' only son. That phrase appears repeatedly in official descriptions because it establishes something simple and devastating. He was not one child among several. He was their only son. And there are losses that cannot be balanced mathematically. No replacement exists. No second child occupies the exact same place. No legal victory reverses it. No prison sentence can restore the years that were taken. Even if a killer is convicted, the family does not receive the life that was stolen. And in Daniel's case, there was not even a conventional trial against the man identified as the primary subject. Roy Den Hollander died the day after the attack. The person investigators believed responsible would never sit in a courtroom and hear the evidence against him. He would never face Daniel's parents across a courtroom. He would never be forced to listen to testimony about the young man whose life had ended. There would be no jury verdict. No sentence. No final judicial declaration of guilt. The family was left with something far more complicated. Certainty about what had happened, but no courtroom ending. The investigation nevertheless began to reveal the world Daniel had been pulled into. The deeper investigators looked into Den Hollander, the more disturbing the picture became. There were writings. There were grievances. There were hostile statements. There were names. There were targets. And there was another murder. 8 days before the attack in New Jersey, Mark Angelucci, a California attorney associated with men's rights advocacy, had been shot and killed at his home. Investigators noticed a striking similarity. The attacker in that case had also reportedly used the appearance of a delivery worker to gain access. Then came the connection between the two men. Both Angelucci and Salas had appeared within Den Hollander's orbit. Both represented something he had developed grievances against. And according to investigators, both names were connected to a larger list. The pattern transformed the investigation. What initially looked like a shocking attack on a federal judge's home began to resemble something more deliberate. Something planned. Something wider. And that made Daniel's death even more painful. Because if investigators were correct, Daniel was not the person who had triggered the killer's hatred. He was collateral damage in a vendetta aimed elsewhere. The word, collateral, can sound clinical. Almost sterile. It belongs to military reports and legal documents. But there is nothing clinical about what it means inside a family. Collateral damage is a son who does not come home. It is a father recovering from multiple gunshot wounds. It is a mother learning that the attack meant for her had reached her child instead. It is a family photograph that suddenly becomes unbearable to look at. It is a birthday that will never be celebrated again. It is a future that stops at 20. The language of investigations can describe events. It cannot fully describe grief. And this is where Daniel's story must be separated from the story of Roy Den Hollander. Because true crime narratives have a dangerous tendency to give the perpetrator too much space. We learn what he believed, what he wrote, what he planned, what he hated, what he thought he was entitled to. And if the story is not careful, the victim becomes merely the final chapter of the offender's biography. Daniel deserves the opposite. The killer's ideology should be understood only insofar as it explains how the violence reached the door. The center of this story should remain the person who lost his life. Daniel. 20 years old. A son. A member of a family. A young man whose life had not yet reached its full shape. The most haunting question is not necessarily, why did Den Hollander hate Esther Sales? Investigators spent years answering that question. There were legal disputes. There were ideological grievances. There were writings. There were perceived enemies. There was a pattern of retaliation. But another question remains much harder to answer. Why did Daniel have to die for someone else's anger? There is no satisfying answer. Because there was never a legitimate connection between Daniel and the grievance. He did not have to die. Nothing about his life made his death inevitable. Nothing about a court case made violence necessary. Nothing about a disagreement made murder unavoidable. The attack was a choice made by another human being. That distinction matters. Daniel was not the consequence of a legal dispute. He was the victim of a decision to turn grievance into violence. In the days following the shooting, the attention of the nation moved rapidly toward the investigation. FBI agents, federal prosecutors, evidence collection, ballistics, digital records, travel routes, rental vehicles, the suspect's movements, his writings, his possible targets. Every detail was examined. But somewhere underneath all of that was one fact that could not be analyzed away. A 20-year-old young man was dead. His father was badly wounded. His mother had survived. And the house where they had lived as a family had become a crime scene. A place that once represented privacy now contained evidence. A front door became a symbol of vulnerability. A delivery disguise became a symbol of deception. A gun became the final instrument in a grievance that Daniel had never created. The investigation would eventually point toward Den Hollander with increasing force. On July 20th, the day after the attack, federal authorities identified him as the primary subject. But he was already dead. That meant investigators were not pursuing a living suspect who could be arrested. They were reconstructing the mind and movements of a dead man. Every piece of evidence became part of a puzzle that had to speak for itself. A weapon. A list. Written material. Connections between victims. The timing. The similarities between attacks. And the apparent focus on people connected to Den Hollander's grievances. The evidence could explain the attack. But it could not undo it. For Daniel's parents, the distinction between explanation and justice would have been especially painful. Knowing why something happened does not make it easier to accept. Sometimes it makes the horror sharper. If the attack had been random, there would have been one kind of terror. But if the attack was deliberate, planned and motivated by revenge, then every detail raises another question. How long had the plan existed? How much preparation had occurred? How many times had the attacker thought about the house? How many opportunities had he imagined? How many names had he written down? How close had the danger been before anyone knew it existed? And most frightening of all, how much of this could have been prevented? That question would later become part of a much larger national debate. Federal judges began receiving greater attention to their personal security. The availability of judges' addresses and other personal information online became a serious concern. The danger was no longer theoretical. A person with a grievance could search for a judge. A person with enough determination could locate a home. And a person's public position could become a vulnerability for everyone living behind the same front door. Daniel's death exposed that vulnerability in the most brutal way possible. The target of the alleged attack was a federal judge. But the victim was her son. That difference would echo far beyond one New Jersey home. Years later, Daniel's name would become attached to legislation designed to protect federal judges and their families. The Daniel Andel Judicial Security and Privacy Act carried his name. It was a way of translating one family's tragedy into a broader demand for protection. Names and addresses. Personal information. Online databases. Public records. The digital trails that can make a private home surprisingly easy to locate. The legislation was not a substitute for Daniel's life. Nothing could be. But there is a profound symbolism in attaching his name to a law intended to protect others. A young man who had no role in the judicial system became part of the history of judicial security. Not because he chose that role. Because violence forced it upon him. And perhaps that is how Daniel should ultimately be remembered. Not as the son of a famous judge. Not as the accidental victim in someone else's vendetta. Not merely as the 20-year-old killed in the attack on Judge Salas. But as Daniel. A young man who had a family that loved him. A young man who should have had decades ahead of him. A young man whose life should have continued far beyond the walls of a New Jersey home on a summer evening. The crime lasted only moments. The consequences did not. The gunfire ended. The investigation began. The suspect died. The evidence was collected. The headlines eventually moved on. But for Daniel's parents, time could not simply move forward in the same way. Because 20 years is not the end of a story. It was supposed to be the beginning of the next chapter. And on July 19, 2020, someone else's hatred tore that chapter out before Daniel had the chance to write it. Part 4, The Incident. The knock at the door. Sunday, July 19, 2020. North Brunswick, New Jersey. It was the kind of summer evening that should have ended quietly. Inside a private home lived a family that, like millions of others, had no reason to believe that the next few minutes would become permanently engraved in the history of their lives. There was no courtroom. No press conference. No security detail surrounding the property. No police officers standing outside the house. No warning that someone had spent time locating the address of a federal judge and was now traveling toward it with a weapon. Just a home. And behind its walls were 3 people. Federal Judge Esther Salas. Her husband, attorney Mark Andel. And their 20-year-old son, Daniel. The man approaching the house had allegedly come there for one reason. To reach Esther Salas. But the first person he encountered would not be the judge. It would be her family. And within moments, the ordinary safety of their home would disappear. The attack began with something deceptively simple. A delivery. At least, that was how it appeared. A man arrived at the Salas residence wearing clothing intended to make him appear to be a delivery worker. There was nothing inherently suspicious about someone approaching a house with a package. In an ordinary evening, a person standing outside the front door holding something that looked like a delivery would barely register as a threat. That was precisely what made the approach so disturbing. The disguise did not need to be perfect. It only needed to appear believable for long enough. Long enough for someone inside to open the door. Long enough for the attacker to move from the outside world into a position from which he could use his weapon. Long enough to turn trust into vulnerability. The home had a front door. The front door existed to separate the family from the outside world. On that night, it became the point through which the danger entered. Mark Andrew went to the door. He had no reason to expect an assassin. No reason to believe that the person outside had studied the family. No reason to think that someone had deliberately chosen the appearance of a delivery worker to gain access. The man at the door was not announcing himself as an enemy. There was no warning. No confrontation in advance. No argument that could have escalated. The attack was immediate. The weapon came out. Then came the gunfire. The sound of a gunshot inside a home is different from the sound of gunfire heard at a distance. Inside four walls, the noise has nowhere to go. It crashes against ceilings and walls. It reverberates through rooms. It transforms familiar spaces into something frightening and unrecognizable. One moment, there is the sound of an ordinary evening. The next, there is a violent explosion of noise. Mark Andrew was struck multiple times. He suffered serious injuries. Daniel was also hit. The 20-year-old was caught in the attack. The person who had allegedly come looking for his mother had found him instead. And in those few seconds, Daniel's life ended. Some moments in a crime investigation are reconstructed second by second. Investigators look at the physical evidence. They examine trajectories. They analyze bullet casings. They reconstruct where people were standing. They determine how the attacker approached. They establish what happened first and what happened afterward. But for the people inside the house, there was no neat sequence. There was terror. Confusion. Noise. Movement. The instinctive attempt to understand what was happening. And then the unbearable realization that this was not an accident. Someone had come to their home with a gun. Someone was deliberately shooting. Esther Salas was also inside the residence. But she was not standing at the doorway when the gunman opened fire. That fact would later become one of the most chilling details of the case. The person investigators believed had been targeted was alive. Her husband had been shot. Her son had been shot. Daniel was dead. The intended target had survived. The person who appeared to have been merely part of the household had paid the ultimate price. There is no way to know precisely what was happening inside Esther Salas's mind during those moments. But the physical facts are enough to understand the magnitude of the horror. The attack had reached her home. It had crossed the boundary between professional conflict and private life. And it had taken her son. For investigators, the attack immediately raised a critical question. Who had come to the house, and why? At first, the scene would have appeared to be an attempted attack against a federal judge. That alone would have triggered a massive law enforcement response. A federal judge had been targeted at her residence. Her husband had been shot. Her son had been killed. The location was now a major crime scene. Federal investigators would soon become involved. The FBI. Federal prosecutors. Local law enforcement. Investigators examining every available piece of evidence. But the identity of the shooter was not immediately known. The man had arrived disguised as a delivery worker. He had attacked quickly. And he had left behind a family trying to understand why someone had come to their door with a gun. The first hours after a shooting are often filled with uncertainty. Every detail matters. A vehicle seen nearby. A person captured on a camera. A package. A piece of clothing. A description. A phone record. A license plate. A route. A weapon. A fingerprint. A digital search. A witness who remembers something that initially seemed insignificant. Investigators cannot assume which detail will become the key. So they collect everything. The scene becomes a frozen record of the violence. Every object potentially matters. Every movement is reconstructed. Every available camera is examined. And while investigators work, the family is left facing something that cannot be processed like evidence. Daniel is gone. The attack was especially disturbing because it had apparently exploited the most basic assumption people make about their homes. The person at the door has a legitimate reason to be there. A delivery worker belongs outside the home. A package belongs at the doorstep. A knock belongs to ordinary life. But a disguise can turn those symbols of normality into tools. The attacker allegedly understood that. He did not need to force his way through a locked door. He did not need to break a window. He did not need to create an obvious disturbance before reaching his victims. He could simply appear to belong there. That method would later become one of the strongest psychological elements of the case. Because the attack did not begin with violence. It began with trust. And then came the first major breakthrough. Investigators began looking beyond the immediate scene. They began asking about the people who might have had a reason to target Esther Salas. The question was not simply, who hated her? It was, who had interacted with her professionally? Who had previously appeared before her court? Who had written about her? Who had expressed hostility toward her? Who had the ability and motivation to locate her home? And perhaps most importantly, who could have planned an attack that resembled something more than an impulsive act of violence? The answers would lead investigators toward a man whose name was already connected to the judge. Roy Den Hollander. The connection did not emerge from nowhere. Years earlier, Den Hollander had brought a lawsuit challenging a federal requirement related to military registration. The case had come before Esther Salas. For most litigants, losing or disagreeing with a judge does not automatically become personal. The judicial system depends on the idea that legal disputes can be resolved without turning into personal vendettas. But Den Hollander's relationship with the legal system was different. His public writings showed intense grievances. He had expressed hostile views toward women. He had criticized judges. He had developed a worldview in which perceived legal inequality was connected to a much larger sense of personal injustice. And investigators would later discover material that made the connection to Salas especially disturbing. Her name was not simply somewhere in a court file. She appeared among people who had become objects of his hostility. Then investigators discovered another connection. Only 8 days before the shooting at the Salas residence, another attorney had been murdered. Mark Angelucci. California. July 11, 2020. Angelucci was associated with men's rights advocacy. He was shot and killed at his home. And the method of approach reportedly bore an unsettling resemblance to the New Jersey attack. The attacker had allegedly used the appearance of a delivery worker. A door. A disguise. A weapon. A victim who had no reason to expect an ambush. The similarities were difficult to ignore. 2 attorneys. 2 locations. 2 attacks. 2 people connected, in different ways, to a world of gender-related legal disputes and grievances. and one man whose writings and activities were beginning to connect them. The investigation moved rapidly. On July 20, 2020, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of New Jersey announced that the FBI had identified Roy Den Hollander as the primary subject in the investigation into the shooting at the Salas home. But there was an extraordinary problem. Den Hollander was dead. He had been found in New York, and authorities determined that he had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The man investigators were now examining as the central figure in the case could no longer be questioned. There would be no interrogation, no arrest, no opportunity for investigators to confront him with the evidence, no explanation in his own voice. Only the trail he had left behind. The timing was extraordinary. The attack happened on July 19. By the following day, the suspected perpetrator was already dead. That meant investigators had to reconstruct the case through the evidence surrounding him. His writings, his movements, his possessions, his connections, his possible targets, his weapons, his vehicle, and eventually, a list. A list that would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in the investigation. Because if the list was authentic and represented his intentions, it suggested that Esther Salas was not an isolated target. There were others. Other judges. Other people with whom Den Hollander had grievances. Other names that could potentially have appeared in the path of the same violence. The attack on the Salas family could therefore represent only one part of something much larger. But on the night of July 19, none of that was known. There was only the house, the gunshots, the injured father, the dead son, the surviving mother, and an attacker who had disappeared. That is the reality of the first stage of any major investigation. The public wants answers immediately. Investigators rarely have them. They have questions. They have fragments. They have evidence that may or may not become meaningful. They have witnesses whose memories are shaken by trauma. And they have a crime scene that must be preserved before the passage of time destroys information forever. For the Andor family, the first night would have been impossibly long. Outside, law enforcement would have been working. Inside, the home that had once been private had become a place of forensic examination. The normal rhythm of the household was gone. Every room could contain evidence. Every object could be photographed. Every movement could become part of a timeline. The front door, once nothing more than an entrance, now represented the beginning of the attack. And Daniel's absence would have been impossible to ignore. The investigators were searching for answers. His parents were confronting the question that no investigation could solve. Why him? That question became even more painful as the evidence began to suggest that Daniel had not been the intended target. If investigators were correct that Den Hollander had come looking for Esther Salas, then Daniel's presence at the scene had been tragically incidental. He had not been chosen because of something he had done. He had been exposed because of who his mother was. That is an entirely different kind of victimization. Daniel's life had been pulled into a conflict that existed before him. A conflict between an embittered man and the judicial system. Between a litigant and a judge. Between an ideology and the people he believed represented everything he hated. Daniel had never consented to any of it. He had simply lived in the same house as the person who had become a target. And that is what makes the front door so powerful as a symbol in this case. The attack did not happen in a courtroom. It happened at home. The place where legal identity was supposed to disappear. The place where Esther Salas was supposed to be a mother. Where Mark Andor was supposed to be a husband and father. Where Daniel was supposed to be a son. The attacker allegedly crossed into that private world because he could not separate his grievances from the people he blamed for them. And once he crossed that threshold, the consequences were irreversible. There was no dramatic confrontation between Daniel and Den Hollander. No long argument. No warning speech. No chance for Daniel to understand why the gunman was there. No opportunity to explain that he had nothing to do with the dispute. No chance to say, "You have the wrong person." Because Daniel was not involved. And violence does not always give innocent people the opportunity to explain their innocence. Sometimes it arrives faster than comprehension. Sometimes the victim does not even know why they have become a victim. The attack lasted only moments. But those moments would create a chain of events that extended for years. The FBI investigation. The identification of Den Hollander. The discovery of his death. The investigation into Mark Angelus's murder. The examination of weapons and ballistic evidence. The discovery of potential targets. The examination of online information about judges. The national debate over judicial security. And eventually, legislative efforts bearing Daniel's name. But all of those developments came afterward. For Daniel, there was no afterward. There was only July 19th. Only 20 years. Only a life that should have continued. And then the investigators began looking outward. Away from the house. Away from the immediate crime scene. Toward New York. Toward California. Toward the digital world. Toward the history of Roy Den Hollander. Toward the people whose names appeared in his records. The apparent attack on one judge was beginning to look like part of a larger pattern. The murder of Mark Angelusi was no longer simply another unrelated crime. The similarities in method demanded attention. The timing was striking. And Den Hollander's death meant the investigators had to move quickly to preserve every piece of evidence before the trail went cold. The man they believed stood behind the violence was gone. But his fingerprints were everywhere. In his writings. In his movements. In the names he had recorded. In the weapons investigators would examine. And, potentially, in the connections between two murders separated by thousands of miles. The next stage of the story would therefore become a race against uncertainty. Investigators had a dead suspect. 2 dead victims. A wounded survivor. A federal judge who appeared to have been targeted. And a growing body of evidence suggesting that the attack was not spontaneous. The question was no longer simply who had pulled the trigger. It was, how far had the plan gone? How many people had been selected? How many names were on the list? How long had the plan been developing? And how many more people might have been in danger? Those questions would drive the investigation forward. But before investigators could understand the full scope of the threat, they had to understand the man at the center of it. Roy Den Hollander. His history. His grievances. His writings. His relationships with the people he believed had wronged him. And the disturbing transformation of a legal grievance into something far more dangerous. Because somewhere between a lawsuit filed years earlier and a knock on the door of a New Jersey home, a boundary had been crossed. A boundary between disagreement and obsession. Between resentment and revenge. Between words and violence. And on the other side of that boundary was a 20-year-old young man who had never been part of the fight. Daniel Andor. Part 4, The Incident. The night the door opened. Sunday evening, July 19, 2020. North Brunswick, New Jersey. The day was coming to an end. Inside a quiet residential neighborhood, the world outside was beginning to settle into darkness. Houses stood behind driveways and lawns. Windows glowed from inside. Families were finishing dinner, watching television, checking their phones, preparing for another week. Nothing about the evening announced danger. There was no police activity outside the Salas home. No threatening crowd. No confrontation. No warning that a man had already made the journey toward the house with a firearm. And there was certainly no reason for anyone inside to believe that a simple knock at the front door would become the beginning of a murder. Esther Salas was home. Her husband, Mark Andrew, was home. And their 20-year-old son, Daniel, was home. For the three of them, this was supposed to be an ordinary evening. Instead, it became the last night of Daniel's life. The man who approached the house did not arrive looking like an obvious attacker. According to investigators, he presented himself as a delivery worker. That detail would become one of the most disturbing elements of the entire case. Because a delivery worker is supposed to be ordinary. A package is supposed to be harmless. A knock at the door is supposed to mean that someone has brought something to you. The disguise relied on something very basic. The assumption that people who appear to belong in a familiar role are probably safe. The attacker allegedly used that assumption against the family. He did not announce himself as a threat. He did not force his way inside. He did not begin by breaking glass or kicking down the door. He approached the house in a manner designed to look normal. And somewhere inside the home, someone heard the door. Mark Andrew went to answer it. That single movement would later become one of the most painful moments in the reconstruction of the crime. A father walking toward his own front door. There is nothing extraordinary about that. He could have been expecting a package. He could have been responding to the bell without thinking twice. He could have believed the person outside was exactly who he appeared to be. There was no reason for him to assume that the man on the other side of the door had traveled there with the intention of killing someone. The door opened. And the illusion ended. The gunfire came suddenly. There was no long conversation. No prolonged confrontation. The attacker opened fire. Mark Andrew was struck multiple times. The man who had come to the home was now no longer a delivery worker. He was an armed attacker. The distance between the doorway and the people inside disappeared in an instant. The home became a crime scene while the family was still inside it. And Daniel was caught in the violence. He was 20 years old. He was not the judge. He was not the person who had presided over Den Hollander's lawsuit. He was not an attorney involved in the dispute. He was not an ideological opponent. He was the judge's son. And that night, that was enough to place him in the path of a bullet. There is a strange quality to the first seconds of a violent attack. The human mind does not immediately understand everything. There may be a sound before there is an explanation. A loud crack. Then another. A movement. A scream. A body falling. A sudden smell of gunpowder. The instinct to get down. The instinct to run. The instinct to find someone you love. Everything that was familiar a moment earlier becomes unfamiliar. A hallway is no longer simply a hallway. A doorway is no longer simply a doorway. The room where a family had spent countless ordinary hours becomes a place where someone is fighting to stay alive. And in the middle of that chaos was Daniel. The exact emotional experience of those final seconds belongs to Daniel alone. No investigator can reconstruct the inside of another person's mind completely. No document can tell us everything a victim saw, heard or felt. But the physical reality is known. Daniel was shot. He did not survive. His father survived but suffered severe injuries. And Esther Salas, the apparent target, was not wounded. The intended target, according to the investigation, was still alive. Her family had paid the price instead. That detail would haunt the case. Because it suggested that the attack had never really been about Daniel. He was not the person the gunman had allegedly traveled to confront. He was not the person whose name appeared in the legal dispute that had preceded the violence. He was not the person whose decisions had angered Den Hollander. Daniel's connection to the attacker was indirect. He was connected through his mother. And that is precisely what makes the crime so disturbing. A grievance that begins with one individual can expand until everyone around that person becomes vulnerable. The boundaries disappear. The judge becomes the family. The lawsuit becomes a personal war. The courtroom becomes the house. And the people who had never participated in the dispute become potential victims. For Esther Salas, the attack must have contained a horrifying realization. The violence had reached her home. The place where her professional identity was supposed to end at the front door. In court, she was Judge Salas. Inside the house, she was a mother. But the attacker had apparently followed the judge home. He had crossed the invisible line separating public life from private life. And the cost of that intrusion was measured in her son's life. Outside the house, the world would soon begin to change. Emergency responders would arrive. Law enforcement would begin securing the area. The sound of sirens would replace the ordinary sounds of the evening. Neighbors would see police vehicles. The quiet residential street would become the center of a rapidly expanding investigation. But inside, there was a family tragedy that no amount of emergency response could reverse. Daniel was dead. Mark was badly wounded. Esther had survived. And investigators were faced with a question that had to be answered quickly. Who had done this? At first, there was little reason for the public to know the attacker's identity. The investigators had a crime scene. They had victims. They had a description of the attack. They had the method of approach. But a name was missing. The man had apparently come disguised as someone who belonged there. He had used the appearance of a delivery worker. That meant investigators had to consider not only what happened inside the house, but everything that had happened before the attack. Where had the attacker traveled from? How had he found the address? Had he watched the house? Had he researched the judge? Had he planned an escape route? Had he rented a vehicle? Had he purchased or prepared the weapon specifically for the attack? Was this a spontaneous act? Or had it been planned long before the gunfire? Those questions transformed the case from a local shooting into a federal investigation. The answer began to emerge astonishingly fast. The FBI started examining Esther Salas's professional history. They looked at cases that had come before her. They looked at people who had appeared before her court. And one name quickly stood out. Roy Den Hollander. Years earlier, Den Hollander had been involved in litigation that came before Judge Salas. The dispute involved federal military registration requirements that applied to men. On its face, it was a legal disagreement. A case that belonged in court. A matter to be resolved through briefs, arguments, and judicial decisions. But Den Hollander's relationship with the legal system had become deeply personal. His writings revealed a pattern of hostility. He had criticized women. He had attacked people he considered responsible for injustices against men. And he had singled out individuals with whom he had conflicts. Esther Salas was among them. Then investigators learned something even more disturbing. Roy Den Hollander was already dead. He had been found in New York. His death was determined to be a suicide. The timing was extraordinary. The shooting at the Salas home had occurred on July 19th. By July 20th, investigators had identified Den Hollander as the primary subject of the investigation. But there would be no arrest. There would be no interrogation room. There would be no chance to watch his reaction when investigators presented the evidence. He had removed himself from the legal process before it could begin. The suspect was dead. The victims were not. And the investigation would have to speak for itself. That same investigation soon reached back to California. 8 days before the shooting at the Salas residence, attorney Mark Angelucci had been murdered at his home. July 11, 2020. California. Angelucci was associated with men's rights advocacy. His death had already been a shocking crime on its own. But investigators noticed similarities between the two attacks. The use of a delivery disguise. The approach to a private residence. The sudden gunfire. And then the connection to Den Hollander. The two victims existed within the same broad ideological and legal landscape. One was a California attorney. The other was connected to a federal judge who had presided over litigation involving Den Hollander. 2 killings. 2 homes. 2 people connected to grievances that had occupied Den Hollander's attention. The similarities were too significant to dismiss. Investigators now had to determine whether they were looking at 2 isolated crimes or 2 chapters of the same plan. That question changed the atmosphere of the investigation. If the attacks were connected, then the danger might not have ended with the shooting at the Salas home. There could be other names. Other addresses. Other people. Other homes with doors that could be approached. Other families who had no idea that someone might have placed them on a list. The investigation expanded. And then came another disturbing discovery. A list of potential targets associated with Den Hollander was reportedly found in a vehicle connected to him. Among the names were Esther Salas and Mark Angelucci. The significance was enormous. If the list represented people Den Hollander intended to target, then the 2 murders were no longer merely similar. They could have been part of a larger pattern. Imagine what that discovery means from the perspective of the people whose names appeared on it. A person's name on a list can look harmless. Ink on paper. A digital entry. A few letters. But if the person who wrote those letters is willing to use violence, the meaning changes. A name becomes a destination. A destination becomes an address. An address becomes a house. And a house becomes a potential crime scene. Daniel never needed to be on such a list. He only needed to be standing inside one of those houses. That was the terrifying reality. The investigation also focused on the weapon. Authorities examined a semi-automatic handgun believed to be connected to Den Hollander and compared it with evidence from the shootings. Ballistic evidence can be brutally impersonal. Metal. Cartridge casings. Bullet fragments. Marks left behind by a weapon. But each piece can establish a connection between places that may otherwise seem impossibly far apart. New Jersey. California. New York. Different homes. Different victims. Different days. One potential chain. Investigators were attempting to reconstruct that chain. And every connection made the picture more disturbing. Yet even as the evidence pointed increasingly toward Den Hollander, one question remained. Why? Why would a legal dispute from years earlier become so intense that someone would allegedly travel to a judge's home? Why would a man who believed he had been wrong decide that a court case should end not with an appeal, but with a gun? Why would a person extend his anger beyond the person he blamed? Why would a judge's husband and son become exposed to that hatred? The investigation could identify the mechanism. It could identify the suspect. It could identify the weapon. It could identify the targets. But understanding motive required entering the world of Den Hollander's thinking. And that world was filled with grievances. His writings became important. They revealed a man who had increasingly framed his experiences through conflict. People were divided into enemies and allies. Institutions became symbols of oppression. Women were repeatedly blamed for personal and social grievances. Legal disputes were not simply disagreements. They became evidence of a larger system that he believed was working against him. Esther Salas was not merely a judge who had presided over one of his cases. In his writings, investigators found indications that he had transformed her into something more personal. A symbol. A person he associated with the system he resented. That transformation is psychologically significant. Because once an individual stops seeing another human being as a person and starts seeing them as a symbol of everything they hate, violence can become easier to rationalize. The person disappears. The grievance remains. But Daniel was not a symbol. He was a son. That is perhaps the most important distinction in the entire case. The attacker may have imagined that he was confronting a judge. The reality was that he was entering the home of a family. And families do not contain abstract symbols. They contain people. A father. A mother. A son. A husband. A wife. The moment the gunman pulled the trigger, the legal dispute disappeared. There was no courtroom anymore. Only blood, fear and loss. The death of Daniel also changed the nature of the public conversation. If Esther Salas had been attacked alone, the story would still have been shocking. But because her son was killed, the attack became a stark illustration of something that judges across the country had feared. The threats aimed at public officials do not always stop with the officials themselves. They can reach spouses, children, parents, neighbors, friends, people whose only connection to a dispute is sharing a home with the person being targeted. Daniel represented that vulnerability. The tragedy was therefore larger than one shooting. It became a warning. A federal judge's home was no longer simply a home. A public address could become a weapon. Information available online could become a roadmap. A grievance posted on the internet could become a real-world threat. And a person who had never appeared in court could become a victim because someone else had. The boundary between public information and private safety had become dangerously thin. But on that night, the family did not know any of this. They did not know about the list. They did not know about Mark Angelucci. They did not know that investigators would soon connect the attacks. They did not know that Den Hollander had already died. They did not know that his writings would become evidence. They did not know that years later, legislation would carry Daniel's name. They knew only what was happening in front of them. An armed man. Gunfire. A wounded husband. A dead son. A mother who had survived. That was the entire universe of the crime in those first moments. The gunman eventually left. The house remained. The family remained. The evidence remained. And the questions began. How had he found the address? Why had he come that night? Why had he used a delivery disguise? How long had he planned the attack? Did he expect Esther Salas to answer the door? Had he intended to kill everyone inside? Was Daniel simply caught in the line of fire? Or had the attacker deliberately chosen the household as a whole? Investigators would spend months examining those questions. But one fact would never change. Daniel had been alive when the evening began. By the time it ended, he was gone. The next morning, America would begin learning his name. But for the people who loved him, his name had never been a headline. It was a name spoken at home. A name called from another room. A name written on birthday cards. A name belonging to a son. And now that name would appear in police reports, federal documents, and news broadcasts. The transformation itself is part of the tragedy. A private person became publicly known only because someone had murdered him. As investigators began tracing Roy Den Hollander's final movements, another disturbing possibility emerged. Perhaps the shooting at the Salas home was not the endpoint. Perhaps it was one step in a broader plan. The existence of a target list suggested that other people might have been vulnerable. The murder of Mark Angelucci suggested that the violence had already crossed state lines. The similar method of approach suggested planning. The weapon evidence offered another possible connection. And Den Hollander's writings provided a window into the anger that investigators believed had driven him. The pieces were beginning to fit. But every piece came with the same horrifying realization. The attack had been preventable only if someone could have seen it coming. And no one inside that home had been given that warning. There is a particular cruelty in an attack that begins at the front door. A locked door gives people a feeling of safety. It is a physical boundary. Inside is family. Outside is the world. But the attacker did not need to break through that boundary. He persuaded someone to open it. That is what makes the delivery disguise more than a tactical detail. It is the psychological heart of the attack. Trust was manipulated. Normality was weaponized. And an ordinary act, opening the door, became fatal. For Daniel, there was no opportunity to retreat into the safety of his home. The home itself had become the place of danger. The person who allegedly came looking for his mother had reached the family. And the son who had never been part of the dispute paid the highest price. His death would later help force America to confront the vulnerabilities of federal judges and their families. But that consequence came later. On July 19, 2020, Daniel was not a symbol. He was simply Daniel. 20 years old. At home. With his parents. When the door opened. And the gunfire began. The investigation was now moving faster than anyone inside that house could comprehend. By the next day, a name would emerge. Roy Den Hollander. A dead man. A former litigant. A writer of hostile material. A person connected to both Esther Salas and Mark Angelucci. A man whose alleged target list would raise fears that the violence could have continued. The question would no longer be merely, who killed Daniel Andel? It would become, what had Roy Den Hollander planned, and how many people had been in danger? That question would lead investigators away from the blood-stained doorway and into the hidden architecture of the case. The records. The writings. The travel. The weapons. The names. The other murder. And the final days of a man whose resentment had apparently crossed the line into violence. The next stage of the investigation would reveal just how much preparation may have gone into reaching that New Jersey doorstep. By the morning after the shooting, the Salas home was no longer simply a family residence. It was evidence. Every room, every doorway, every object could potentially answer a question. Investigators had to reconstruct an attack that had lasted only moments, but whose preparation may have taken much longer. The central questions were brutally simple. Who had come to the house? How had he found Esther Salas? Why had he chosen that particular night? And why had a 20-year-old young man named Daniel Andel ended up dead? The FBI had already begun moving toward an answer. But the answer would not come from a single clue. It would emerge from a chain of connections stretching across states, court records, online writings, weapons, vehicles, and another murder that had happened just 8 days earlier. And at the center of that chain was a name investigators already knew. Roy Den Hollander. The first hours. In the immediate aftermath, investigators had to work with the evidence physically present at the scene. The home was treated as a major crime scene. The shooting itself had been sudden, but investigators knew that every second mattered after the fact. A cartridge casing left in the wrong place could establish where a weapon had been fired. A bullet could reveal a trajectory. A mark on a wall could help determine the position of a shooter. A piece of clothing could potentially contain biological evidence. A camera recording could establish the arrival and departure of a suspect. And an apparently insignificant object could eventually connect one location to another. The crime scene therefore had to be approached almost mechanically. Photograph. Document. Collect. Preserve. Compare. Reconstruct. Investigators could not afford to let emotion determine what mattered. At the same time, they were working inside a scene where the emotional reality was impossible to ignore. A young man was dead. His father was seriously injured. And the woman who appeared to have been the intended target had survived. The investigation had to move forward while the family was still trying to understand what had happened. The disguise immediately became important. The attacker had reportedly presented himself as a delivery worker. That meant investigators had to determine whether the appearance had been improvised or planned. Had he obtained clothing specifically for the attack? Had he acquired a package? Had he researched the family's routines? Had he chosen the disguise because he knew that delivery workers could approach the front door without immediately attracting suspicion? The method suggested preparation. The attacker did not simply appear at random and start shooting. He allegedly selected a specific location. He approached the location under a false identity. He carried a firearm. He was able to reach the door. Then he opened fire. Each element pointed toward a deliberate sequence. And deliberate sequences leave trails. The FBI began examining the identity of people who had reasons to be hostile toward Esther Salas. That meant looking backward. Years backward. A federal judge can preside over hundreds or even thousands of legal matters during a career. Most litigants eventually move on. Some are disappointed. Some are angry. Some appeal. Some criticize a decision. But very few transform a courtroom disagreement into a personal campaign against the judge. Investigators wanted to know whether anyone connected to Salas had displayed behavior suggesting that possibility. The search quickly led to Roy Den Hollander. Den Hollander was not a stranger to the federal court system. He had filed litigation involving the military draft registration system, arguing that requirements applying to men were discriminatory. The case had been assigned to Esther Salas. On paper, it was simply another federal lawsuit. A plaintiff. A defendant. A judge. Legal arguments. A decision. But the person behind the lawsuit had a history that investigators would later examine closely. His writings were often deeply hostile toward women. He described himself as a men's rights advocate. He repeatedly expressed anger toward institutions and individuals he believed had treated men unfairly. And his criticism sometimes moved beyond policy. It became personal. That distinction mattered. People can strongly oppose a judge's decision without targeting the judge. They can believe a court ruling is unjust without traveling to the judge's home. The existence of hostility alone does not prove murder. But investigators were no longer examining hostility in isolation. They were examining it alongside a shooting, a disguise, a weapon, and a dead suspect. Then came another name. Mark Angelucci. 8 days before Daniel was killed, Angelucci had been shot to death at his home in California. He was an attorney and an advocate associated with men's rights issues. At first glance, the distance between California and New Jersey was enormous. Different states. Different homes. Different victims. Different local investigators. But the attacks contained a striking similarity. The killer had reportedly approached Angelucci's home while pretending to be a delivery worker. That was not a detail investigators could easily dismiss. One attack involving a delivery disguise might be coincidence. Two attacks involving people connected to the same ideological world demanded scrutiny. And now there was another connection. Den Hollander had links to both men. The investigation therefore widened. Agents began asking whether Angelus's murder and the attack on the Salas family were connected. If they were, then investigators were no longer dealing with one attempted assassination. They might be dealing with a campaign. A campaign requires targets. And targets require names. The search for those names became one of the most important parts of the investigation. The list. Investigators discovered that Den Hollander had apparently kept a list of potential targets. The discovery changed the emotional temperature of the investigation. A list is different from a passing thought. It suggests selection. It suggests organization. It suggests that a person's anger may have moved beyond words and into preparation. Among the names reportedly associated with the list were Esther Salas and Mark Angelusi. That was significant. One had already been murdered. The other had just survived an attack in which her son was killed. The list potentially linked the two cases before investigators had finished understanding either one. But the most frightening implication was what the list might say about people who had not yet been attacked. If Den Hollander had selected multiple individuals, how many remained vulnerable? How many people had no idea their names were sitting in the records of an increasingly violent man? How many families might have been one delivery, one knock, or one ordinary evening away from catastrophe? The list also offered investigators a possible window into the offender's thinking. The people on it were not random. They were connected to grievances. People he believed had wronged him. People he associated with institutions or ideas he despised. People who had become symbols in his personal narrative. This is one of the most dangerous transformations in grievance-driven violence. An individual stops seeing a person as a separate human being. Instead, that person becomes a representative of everything the offender believes is wrong. A judge becomes the system. An attorney becomes the enemy. A political institution becomes corruption. A group of people becomes a single target. Once that transformation occurs, violence can be psychologically reframed by the offender as something larger than murder. But to the victims, there is nothing abstract about it. There is only a body, a family, a life, a loss. Investigators also examined Den Hollander's final movements. He had been traveling. He had access to a vehicle. He had a firearm. And after the shooting at the Salas residence, he was found dead in New York. His suicide meant that investigators had to reconstruct his final days without his cooperation. Every movement became potentially important. Where had he been? Where had he stopped? What had he purchased? Who had he contacted? What devices had he used? What documents had he left behind? Had he been preparing for another attack? Had he already selected additional targets? The answers could determine whether the Salas shooting was an isolated act or one part of a larger sequence. The weapon evidence became another important component. Investigators examined a semi-automatic handgun associated with Den Hollander. The caliber of the weapon was consistent with ammunition involved in the attacks. Ballistics could potentially provide a far more powerful connection than ideology or motive. Ideology can suggest. A list can suggest. A grievance can suggest. But a firearm can leave a physical signature. The microscopic marks left on a bullet or casing can connect a weapon to a shooting. Investigators therefore had to compare the physical evidence from New Jersey with evidence from California. If the same firearm had been used, the relationship between the two murders would become dramatically stronger. The two crimes would no longer merely look similar. They would be physically connected. This is where forensic investigation becomes almost invisible to the public. A television viewer sees a gun. An investigator sees evidence. A cartridge casing is not simply a piece of brass. It can tell a story. Where it landed. How it was marked.